Airea D. Matthews is the 2022-23 Philadelphia Poet Laureate and directs the poetry program at Bryn Mawr College. Her first collection of poems is the critically acclaimed Simulacra, which won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Award, and many honors include an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship and a Pew Fellowship. This evening, she brings her new collection, Bread and Circus. She will be joined in conversation with Phillip B. Williams, the Whiting Award-winning author of Thief in the Interior and Mutiny. Please welcome our guests to the Free Library.
Let's just start with a poem. Also, thanks for coming. Thanks for having us. Etymology, could you read etymology for us?
I would love to read etymology. Etymology. Because my mother named me after a child born still, to a godmother I've never met, I took another way to be known, something easier to remember, inevitable to forget, something that rolls over the surface of thrush, because I grew tired of saying, no, it's pronounced. Now I tire of not conjuring that ghost I honor. Say it with me. Era. That's really sweet that y'all did that. Rhymes with Sarah. Sarah from the Latin meaning a woman of high rank, which also means whenever I ask anyone to hold me on their lips, I sound like what I almost am. Hear me out. I'm not a D or a river charging through working class towns where union folk cog wedge for plots and barely any house at all, where bosses mangle ethnic phonemes and nobody corrects one word because the check's in the mail. So let's end this classist pretense where names don't matter and language is too heavy a lift. My E is silent, like most people should be. The consonant is sonorant, is a Black woman, or one might say, the spine. I translate to wind in a country known for its iron, imply lioness of God in Jesus' tongue, mean apex predator, free of known enemy, fierce enough to harm or fast enough to run. All I'm saying is what I've already said. The tongue has no wings to flee what syllables it fears. The mouth is no womb, has no right to consume what it did not make.
Ah, you got bars. You've always had bars. You had them in Simulacra. I have a question. So, of course, I have a question. That's my job. Etymology, it's not an early poem. It's kind of midway in the book.
Yeah.
It feels like you're not reintroducing yourself. Well, maybe you are reintroducing yourself. Do you see maybe Bread and Circus as not a debut, but you maybe more so stepping into who you want readers to know who you are, or maybe you're introducing, the speaker is introducing you to yourself in a kind of way for the first time?
That's a great question. I think that that's true. I think with the first book that I wrote, Simulacra, one of the things that I noticed about that, which was my true debut, but one of the things I noticed about that book was that it was an anti-confessional. So anything that was confessed could be attributed to a speaker that wasn't me. It didn't necessarily have to be the author. So when there were conversations happening with Anne Sexton, I created these poems that were text messages to Anne Sexton. So under the guise of the text message, the speaker could have been anyone. The speaker was undetermined. And so there was this sense that I could fade to black in that book, and I did. Primarily because I wasn't ready to confront or to admit or to confess what I truly wanted to say, the part of the story that I actually wanted to tell. And that just took time. And I think that as authors, one of the things that we have to give ourselves permission to do is to just be in time. Mm-hmm. Be wherever you are at the moment, engaging your work with your level of comfort. And when I wrote that book, I wasn't in the book in the way that I wanted to be in this book. I wanted to make known aspects of my life that I left open in Simulacra. So I think of it as a continuation, but more so I think of it as evolution, growth. When you know yourself, you're able to be yourself, you're able to be authentic, you're able to talk through the hard things of being, the hard components of being. So it's really an open door. I gave myself the invitation to truly be myself, which is a gift. Mm-hmm. And so I think when I wrote etymology, I actually wrote etymology when I was visiting Scotland, and I'd gone to the University of Edinburgh to get in Adam Smith's archives. I wanted to read his papers and his letters and see the pages originally handwritten. It's really a gorgeous and actually a moving opportunity if you get a chance to engage with archives in that way. If you ever get the chance to be with an archive where you have to use gloves in order to handle it or touch it, it's a very moving opportunity. And so I was there and I felt overwhelmed after reading what I believe was Old English. It was like, it was Old English to me. The F's looked like S's. It was just everything was a blur. So I said, I need to kind of come back into this century. So I stopped, I left, and I went to a Starbucks. And in Scotland, I was learning the landscape, and they called these small waterways that cut through towns, they called them D's. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's not who I am. I don't cut through towns, and I'm not a small waterway. So I wanted to write a poem that introduced myself in a way that I've always known myself. I'd always introduced myself to other people as D, because I thought that trying to explain my name, one, took too much intellectual and emotional capital from the person I was talking to, not from me, but to the other person. You have to remember the E is silent, it rhymes with Sarah. There's a lot of things that one has to remember about a name, and that felt like a lot, felt like a heavy lift. But then I thought, it's worth it. We hold a lot of hard words in our heads and our mouths, and it's okay. And also to give people the chance to make error, to say the wrong thing, to be incorrect. And no judgment on that, but just to gently correct or school, and this is how you do it. That's how conversations start. It doesn't start by denying who fundamentally you are. I just didn't feel like I aligned with D. I felt like I aligned with what I was supposed to be, which was Era, and is Era. Yeah.
Not Airea.
Not
Area.
Not Area. Not Erica. Not Aaron. Not Erna. Now, I've heard it all. I've heard people put numbers in my name, so it's been a lot.
You're a child of Musk.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I appreciate you still allowing me the slippages of D, because that's how
yeah, there's a grandfather clause. Like, so many people know me as D, and so, yeah, I still answer to that name. It's still very much who I am, but I think going forward, how I introduce myself is really Era, and then kind of the old school crew knows me still as D.
Yeah.
I'm still both of those people, just different.
Just different?
Yeah.
I like that. Vivie Francis had a similar understanding of her transition from book 1 to books 2 and 3, where she was saying that there was a critique that maybe she was hiding behind persona poems in the first book.
Blue Flytail.
Yeah, and then when Horse in the Dark came out and Forest Primeval, she put herself on the forefront. And so you're saying time is what helped you to move toward that. Is there a way to, because I'm thinking about the timing of this book, one of the earliest poems in here, I had the privilege of publishing at Vinyl before we were even thinking about a pandemic being possible. How many of the poems in this book came to you during 2020? And, well, answer that first, because there's a lead-in question to some of the topics that are in the book that might be inspired by the time that we were all forced to take off. during that time.
Right, we had a forced vacation, staycation. I think one of the, exactly, a hiatus. I think the oldest poem in the book, quite frankly, is probably written in 2010, which means that I was writing some of these poems when I was also writing some of the poems in Simulacra. So it's interesting how poems come together for you and how books come together and how poems cohere. When I was writing Simulacra, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, but when I was writing Simulacra, many of those poems came to me late at night. I was dealing with insomnia, and I was in graduate school. And so they very much were kind of these meticulous workshop poems. And then when I came to this book, Bread and Circus, I allowed myself in the writing of these poems to be more experimental and messier. Because isn't that how life is, right? We try things, they fail. We try again, they fail. We try harder, as Samuel Beckett tells us. And so we just keep trying. And I wanted the structure and the shape, which I think the shape of poems is very sensuous. And I wanted the shape of the poems to convey movement, growth, evolution. It didn't have to be left justified. They didn't have to be perfectly symmetrical in terms of their stanzaic counts and their prosodic meters. I just kind of wanted it to be reflective of who I was becoming as a writer. And so, as I was saying, the earliest one was 2010. I didn't know any of that then. I was just writing. And the more recent ones were towards the tail end of the book, kind of deal with the pandemic. And so they, of course, came in 2020, 2021 time, 2019, 2021 timing, because I had a lot of time to think. I think we all did. And actually, that time to think helped me to carve out a structure for this book that I couldn't have conceived of without the pandemic. I don't think I would have thought of othering, for instance, and we'll talk a little bit more about this maybe a little bit later, but I wouldn't have thought about othering as alienation. And I wouldn't have thought about alienation as one of the tenets of the free market societies or classical economics. And so as I had time to kind of lay out these concepts, like, oh, alienation is othering. Alienation is also a part of the free market economy. I had time to kind of give a spine to the structure of the poems, the structure of the book, and to intuit my own little reasoning that I'm still searching for words for. I think it's weird when people ask you, what were you doing? And you're just like, I wrote poems. And yeah, and that was the thing. And even back then, when Issity came out, this was like 2012, 2011?
Yeah, it was much earlier,
Yeah, so when Issity came out, I was so struck by that story of the young girl that I had to capture it. And that structure, that prose-like structure, that journalistic structure was the only way that I could make sense of any of it. And so I gave myself the stricture of, can you write a journalistic type of poem? And that's really what I wanted to do. And I just continued to do that. I always ask myself when I'm writing, can you do this? And sometimes the answer is absolutely not. And sometimes you surprise yourself, and the answer is yes, you can. Just keep at it. Yeah.
And I asked about the pandemic because while you were writing poems, I was in bed, and not resting. It was depression. The isolation that you're talking about had that kind of effect on me. And there was also a way the conversation was, how is capitalism dying under the pandemic? How are things frozen? And with the book being both a critique but also a conversation with, I think, the systems of capitalism and also Marxism, because you have Guy Debord also, who is a counter to this, this godfather maybe of capitalism in a way. And so I was wondering if maybe the pandemic, in its freezing of being able to just buy whatever and go out and fulfill whatever our capitalist needs were, allowed you that time to contemplate. So there was the irony of, not being able to go out and be the mask self that we usually, are when we're,
Exactly.
performing.
Exactly. It was a focusing mechanism
Yeah.
for me. And so I didn't have any of the Du Bois poems before the pandemic. I started reading The Society of the Spectacle. So just to step back, there's two secondary characters in Bread and Circus. One is Adam Smith. Adam Smith, you may know, is the kind of the founding father of classical free market economics. He wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, which also so happens to be the year that the Declaration of Independence was penned and chartered. And he actually, in my studies, I found out that he met with Ben Franklin, or Ben Franklin came to him in Scotland just before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So I thought that that was interesting. So the year 1776 was in my head for some reason. Smith also talks about this other theory. Well, he talks about two things: free market economics, alienation. But alienation as we know it, he describes it as kind of this division of labor, which has later become concretized as what we know in America as class. But he also forwarded this theory that for years, when I first heard it in a Penn classroom in the 90s, I was trying to figure out, that doesn't make any sense to me. And it was the invisible hand theory, this idea of self-interest, and that the high tide lifts all boats, and that self-interest will lead to optimal economic outcomes. And as someone who didn't even begin to taste optimal economic outcomes until probably the late 90s, when I was working and on my own, it felt like it was kind of this pie in the sky, illusory theory. And then entered into my reading Guy Debord, who penned The Society of the Spectacle in 1967. And he was also the founder of something called the Situationist International Movement. And so the Situationists were a group of artists and thinkers who in the 50s and 60s were led by two primary instincts. One was détournement, and I'm pronouncing that all wrong. I know it. I'm not a French speaker.
Well, I said Guy and it's Guy, so we're saying
Okay,
both.
great. So détournement, which is the hijacking of cultural artifacts, which is kind of what I did. So I used kind of the Situationist International Movement as a guiding factor for how, and Adam Smith, because I used extraction as a guiding factor for how I wanted to play with these other theorists and these other thinkers. Interestingly enough, he also talked about psychogeography, Debord, that is, talked about psychogeography, which is really walking around a place, getting to know a geography so you can understand the emotions, and you can understand the behaviors of the people who inhabit the place, so that you can have a point of human connection. So where Smith was populating my mind with these theories that never made any sense, Debord was also giving me some ideas for how to structure it all, how to pull it under one large circus umbrella, if you will. One large circus tent. And so I had these two thinkers dancing around in my head for a couple of years. And I thought, what better way to bring them together, even though they're on opposing ends of the economic theory spectrum. I thought it might be interesting if we had some time to sit kind of in that interstitial space between those two ends. And that, for me, is personal experience and life. And so how do you sit inside of that gully, that trench, that space, and contemplate? So I'm trying to bring these two theories together through just the example of one life.
Love it. Yeah. Can we hear We Was Kings?
Yeah, for sure. You can hear it if I can find it.
'43.
Thank you. We was kings. Been trying to show you history don't change much. There's hard proof erasure repeats. What we learn to accept are tidy myths full of men who look unlike me, still people, but not like my dad or my uncle who would share stories about a line of black kings in Scotland. How in 967, Doe the Black, son of Malcolm, was called vehement nigger. Doe was driven off the field by his cousin, Colin, next in line. How that king was offed by Doe's brother, Kenneth, who looked a lot like Obama if Obama lived in Kirkcaldy in the late 900s. Even then, brothers wilded out in a country that found it suitable to call their kings niggers. This went on until every mud-tongue fisher of sweet bone bread ground to chalk. Until the new kings with lighter eyes and narrow features commissioned portraits in which every past heir had a porcelain face. Only the backgrounds had any dark. All those kings who looked familiar, waiting as muted novas in a celestial sea of utter blankness.
Very good. Can you talk about the relationship between economics and addiction? That space between the wager, what is wagered in the crux of those two abstractions? For instance, is it my time on earth, the life, the breath that I breathe, for moments of prestige? Or is it my soul for a brief feeling? What is the exchange rate between, what happens in that relationship between economics and addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think how I've always kind of put it to words is that a consumerist perspective will always lead to some sort of addictive behavior, right? Because you'll believe if there is a consumer good to be had, and addictive goods, drugs, gambling, those are all addictive goods. Addictive goods are consumer goods. And why do people want consumer goods? Well, they want consumer goods because they believe that what's there is better than what's here, or what I might have will make my life better than what it is. And I think that there's really no difference in that. And so I think the way that I've thought about it and the way that I've tried to render it in these poems is just kind of thinking about, it's back to the gulf, back to that in-between space. What is in between economics and what is in between addiction? And then I started thinking about my father. My father was a heroin addict all of my life. He died of AIDS in 1996, most likely from dirty needles, but we don't know for sure. The reality is that he was a mentally ill man, and he picked up his addiction in Vietnam. And it seems to me that when you are mentally ill, marginally employed, how do you find comfort? How do you numb? And street pharmaceuticals are the way to do it if you don't have money. If you are not engaged in the medical industrial complex in any real way or have any engagement with it through insurance or otherwise, how do you soothe? And because we live in a consumerist society, and because we constantly think there's something that can make whatever this is that I'm going through better, drugs can be it. It's the same way for the gambler. Like the gambler who comes to the table knowing what they bet, they probably will lose it, but there's something about having that kind of adamancy of like a Pentecostal preacher where you're like, no, this is it. I'm telling you, this is it. Just like they think Jesus is coming back every 2 minutes. The gambler thinks that this is it.
The win.
I can win.
Yeah.
I'm gonna win. And that's the chase, and it's the chase brought on by the idea that the out there is better than the in here. Some people might say it's the grass is greener on the other side. I think it's a lot more complex. I think that to the degree that we can buy to make us feel better, instead of really excavating to figure out what it is that is making us feel worse, we can cover it up, and we will cover it up with whatever is available to us. And so for somebody who was a hustler, which was very much my father, it was gambling and the street pharmaceuticals. And it's how it made him, I'm trying to have compassion. In the later years, I tried to have compassion for him, but it was how he saw himself getting well. Mm-hmm. It was the only way that he knew. And when applied under the lens of compassion, that's what we all do to some degree. It's just, I have insurance. He didn't.
Right. Oh, you're just gonna drop the mic there? Oh, man. I had a question, but you stopped too soon.
Sorry, I can keep going.
No. It had to do with Swindle, which I would like you to read next, but earlier on you were talking about being isolated. But I feel like in this book, even though that is there, even in the poems that are really hard to get through because of the topics, no one is alone. Like there's always someone, even if it's just a speaker who's watching very intimately, very closely, giving that kind of grace and care to who they're looking at. I mean, there's the there's the poem that I love when you read that just has the N-bomb over and over and over again. But even in that, because the critique is so precise, it shows that you've been paying attention to the very thing that is in question.
Yeah.
And so there's always a sense of care in Bread and Circus, even when on the other end it is someone who has been isolated, who has been not taken care of. Can you speak to maybe if that's part of process or just who you are as a person, how you see these poems as being a kind of embrace of those who have been isolated?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think any particular parts of our lives will find ourselves having been isolated at some point from something that we wanted or something that we desired. And for me, isolation, first of all, I am self-isolating still, very much so. And I have taught my family the lovely, lovely world of self-isolation. Unfortunately, we are all antisocial. But I see them like doing a high five. Oh, I'm sorry, I have one son that is not antisocial, Trey. My oldest son is a sports broadcaster, and he's an extrovert. I don't know where he came from. But the isolation for me gives me time to think through some of these things. So as opposed to just as someone who just accepts it as it is or who needs to numb it, I sit with it. So I've developed a skill with sitting with discomfort. And I find some value in that. And a lot of these poems are very difficult, right? They're hard to read. You feel as you're reading through them. And that's the point. It's because what happens if we learn to do difficult things, if we learn together as a point of human connection to sit through difficult things and difficult topics and just to be with each other. So what these poems are, it's an opportunity for me to be less isolated. And as you're reading, you're with me. Even if I don't see you or know you, I know that you're there. And that helps me, like knowing that someone will read this eventually. And I don't write everything with the intention of having it publicly read, but for the things that I do write, it matters that we share those moments. It's trying to find that point of human connection. And that means everything to me as an artist, as a mom, just being able to have these moments of intimacy. Now, some may feel like those are manufactured moments of intimacy because they've been curated, but what isn't?
That's what I was saying.
Like, what isn't curated, So however it's curated, whether you're set up on a blind date or if you're on dating apps or if you're meeting someone in public for the first time, there's always the curation. So, yeah, I'm curating human connection.
Human connection. Can we hear Swindle?
Yes. Swindle, this is not in the book, but I'll tell you, this is Trenton, New Jersey, 1977. Learn the suits, Ace. A club looks like a three-leaf clover. A spade is an upside-down heart. A diamond looks like two kissing triangles. A heart is a goddamn heart. A hand is 5 cards, 1 card each finger. The ace is the highest, followed by head cards, king, queen, jack, then count back by 10, that's the rank. You get what I'm giving? Bring a Barbie doll, something to play with. Circle the players from afar. I, your sneaky Uncle Nate, nigga tucks cards under his cuff. Pull on his sleeve, ask for a hug. If it feels stiff, say you're thirsty. Don't crawl under that table lest you want a gun in my mouth. Don't sniff the powder on the felt, and boy, don't touch those chips. They're worth more than us both. You see what I'm saying? Aim for loose play. Every motherfucker's hungry. When the game is tight, stakes get too fat too quick. You'll lose before the draw. Spy those hands, ace. Tell me what you see. Scratch your chin, rub your nose, pull on your ear. We got a code. Eat. Thing is, that ace is tricky. Hinges on what's held. It can play high or low. A full house ain't shit. Bend the straight. Fuck a pair. Fear that flush. If you see those head cards in order with the same suit, grab your baby doll, go to the bathroom, flush the toilet twice, stick one finger down your throat, bloat your cheek. Run out. Force lunch on the table. Say, Daddy, my head hurts. We make dust, baby boy. Only lose what little you left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question between the two of us, and then we'll...
Sure.
And then maybe one poem.
Yeah.
After that.
I'm for it.
This is not part of that. I just remember that when I first read Swindle, and it said, and boy, don't... I was like, boy, who's the boy?
Ah,
but then later on...
You figure that out.
Yeah. In Ars Poetica 1979, my excommunicated ex-Navy father, come here, boy. Though I was a girl, he called me boy because he wanted one. Mm-hmm. So even then, there's this exchange, this fungibility, this exchange rate.
This exchange, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
I like how there's a narrative, like there's a story that's being told throughout the book, whatever seems to be, not a secret, but suspenseful, eventually gets unraveled. Yeah, toward the end.
Yeah.
So the last question, I prepared you for this. I texted it to you. That's why I have to read it, because it's a doozy. I don't even know why I wrote this one. Okay.
Do it. Let's do it. I know which one it is.
You know which one it is, yeah. Because the concept of bread and circus is like the elite distracting those who have not with things that they should already like they should be resources, but they're made into forms of entertainment. They're made into trivialities. Souvenirs, kind of like stand-ins for what belongs to them. And so I'm asking, do your poems escape the threat of themselves becoming spectacle? There's a loaf of bread, which could be the material of the poems, their heaviness, their undaunted reach, and then the circus, which are the intimacies that you spoke about with that you share with the public, a contract that risks any ungifted, ungenerous reader being merely entertained by the harsh realities that you present. Is there a way that a poet can even avoid that exchange rate?
I don't think so. I think that I started thinking about the word spectacles from the word spectere, Latin meaning to watch. But also there's another word, there's another Latin word meaning a show. And so to the degree that you are an observer of the world, you're spectating. To the degree that you are the observed, you're being surveilled. And we can't escape that, particularly in our present technological age. We're constantly surveying, we're constantly surveilling, we're constantly spectating. So I think as a writer, you can't escape it, but I also think as a person, you can't, right? And there's some degree of necessity in observing the spectacle, right? I think the necessity is that you begin to understand how things work. And if you understand how things work, then you're better able to assess what needs to stop being as it is, what needs to be reassessed, what needs to be reevaluated. So I don't know that there's a way that we move away from spectacle. So when I was talking about the spectacle in Bread and Circus, the circus itself, there's also a degree of self-indictment. I'm indicting myself as someone who's participating in the spectacle, in the circus, and I can't get away from it. I think it's very human of us to, that may be a point of human connection. We are all inside of the circus. We are all in the matrix. And maybe there's a few of us who can pull that, the fact and the beauty and the brutality out of that, but maybe all of us can. But there's really no way to get around being in the spectacle, being made a spectacle, because you're being watched. And not in, I don't want you to leave here feeling as if you need to turn off all of your phones and do any of those things. That's unnecessary, but they'll find you if they want to find you. But nevertheless, we are being watched, and most of it is just by each other.
Right.
In this kind of intimate environment, it's the sense that we're learning from each other, right? We're growing with each other. We're growing past where we were into something new, and we're doing that together. And I'm being a witness to it. So I think there's two different types of spectacle. One, I think there's the conscious spectacle, and the conscious spectacle is kind of the mindful spectacle. It's the one where you're an observer, you're paying attention, you're mindful of how things are working and how things are moving. And then there's the unconscious spectacle, and that is the one that is a little bit trickier and more dangerous, because that is where you are more likely to manipulate and be manipulated. And I think the best thing that we might be able to do is to look to trying to be mindful in our spectation, trying to be mindful of the spectacle, and to address it with a certain degree of awareness and consciousness, rather than to ignore it or to completely extract ourselves from it, because that is almost impossible. So yeah, I think poets are spectators. I think that we are spectacles. I think we open our lives up to that, and not in a way in which we're trying to manipulate or be manipulated. It is so that we are living witnesses of what's happening. We are living witnesses, and we are documenting what's happening, and importantly, what's happened.
And the risk of telling the truth in the age of disbelief is not really something that we can control.
It's not anything that we can control.
It's utterly subjective.
Right, because if someone disbelieves, or even if we disbelieve, we have no control over that. We have no control over people's belief systems, nor should we. All we can do is to tell the truth, be the truth, walk in love, and hope that's enough. And if it's not, then so be it.
So be it. It's your turn.
I loved everything. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
I love that you talked about the movement, the form of the poems themselves individually. I wondered if you could talk about the actual arranging of the collection. Not necessarily, just how long it took, but how things sit side by side, how you made those decisions for this book.
Thank you for asking that. It was intentional. It was highly intentional. And so one of the things that I see Shami Ali just walked in the back door. She's one of my closest friends, and as I was thinking about structuring this book, she was very helpful to me in figuring out, I actually always structure according to music. It's almost always. I don't know why this is. I'm very interested in contrapuntals. I'm very interested in musical composition. I am not good enough in math to be a musicologist, and I have no musical ability whatsoever besides my voice. But I do think that there's something that music can give us in learning how to structure, how books cohere, actually. And so I talked to a friend of mine. Shami Ali mentioned Love Supreme by John Coltrane. So if you notice the sections, those sections are plucked directly from the movements in John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. And A Love Supreme was a composition, and then I sat with my lovely partner and husband and just listened to Love Supreme one night, and then listened again, and then listened again, and then listened again. And something I noticed about the through composition, which my friend who's a musicologist explained to me, was that the through composition is that every part is distinct. It is its own thing, and it's moving forward. And so there's a sense in the through composition of momentum, but there's also a sense that what happened in the past is in the past and something new can move forward. So when you listen to A Love Supreme, in each overture, each section, you hear a new instrument moving forward. You'll hear a new instrument moving, like you'll hear it as the primary structure in that song. It's the primary voice of that song. And I wanted to enact that with poems. How can you through compose a book of poems? And the way that you do it is through sections that move forward, but they move forward in a very different way. And they may topically be dealing or thematically be dealing with different things, but they're still moving in the same direction. So almost like a crowd, if you will, that's moving forward. We're all moving in the same direction. We're moving at a different pace, or we're different heights, our strides are different. And so that's what I was trying to enact, and that's why movement, well, that's not movement was already important before I got the actual structure of the book. But having friends and loved ones who are the ones that say, this is something that you might learn from. And then you going and doing the research and figuring out how that might make sense for what you're doing. I don't believe in coincidence. And so every time someone says something to me, it means something. It's a terrible way to live. I don't suggest it. But it's how I move in the world. And so when I had 3 people talking about Love Supreme, I thought it was a message. I was like, oh, okay, there's something I'm supposed to be doing here. And so I just followed through with it. And I just wanted each section to be distinct, to be its own thing, and then to move forward. And that's it. That was the simplest part of the book for me, was learning how to put those poems together. And then I listened to When Doves Cry on repeat and put everything on the floor and sectioned it off and cordoned it off and tried to make each end section poem not necessarily have anything to do with the first poem of the next section, but have some echoes in there, right? So if you think of harmony in Coltrane's Love Supreme as the echo that moves throughout, the melodic echo that moves throughout, that's true, but the instruments are different. The instruments that come forward are different. And so that's what I was really trying to do. There's still echoes in each section, but ideally I wanted it to be each thing to have kind of a new harmonic resonance. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
My question is about your work at the university. How and maybe in what ways are you finding your connection with an institution supporting or constraining your creativity?
Oh, that's a great question. I happen to be at a great institution that leaves me alone. And I know that is not the case for many folks in higher education. I think it helps me that I'm at a liberal arts college so that I can ask as many questions as I'd like and get them answered, so it doesn't feel, my particular situation doesn't feel as if I'm in a corporation. But I think that if I did teach at the University of Michigan for a spell, and I did feel very much like I was a part of an evil corporation. And that's on record, but don't cut that out. But at Bryn Mawr, it's a little bit different because it's, my colleagues are so close by that I can just feel free to ask questions and pop in and do all that kind of stuff. And that is helpful for me because I'm curious. And when I think about myself actually in real time, I feel very much like a golden retriever. So I kind of come up to people and I'm like, hey, do you have answers to this thing? And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But it's also been very helpful for me in my research because a lot of my research is funded through my college. And they provide grants and all those different types of things. The good thing is that they don't track and I don't want to say this carefully because I don't want them to start doing this. They don't really, I'm not necessarily needing to go back and say, this is what I produced, because they'll see it in my final project, which is the book. They don't need to know, they don't micromanage my research. They don't micromanage my questions. And I think that's distinctly because I'm at a small liberal arts college. Now, there is a possibility that that could happen at a larger college, and I would resist that to the degree that I could. Because I do think that they try and have a say in the types of things that you research, the types of questions that you ask. And I'm not for that. I'm going to ask what I want to ask. I'm against strongly opposed to being led in the way of thinking. I'm very much a critical thinker who likes to ask the questions that I like to ask. So if that were to ever be my case, I would probably leave I would leave the ivory tower. There's no doubt in my mind. I couldn't deal with that. So my apologies to people that have to deal with that.
Thank you. This is a really meaningful night that the two of you have put on. It's really great. Simulacra was so inventive, and I'm just getting into Bread and Circus. And my question is, formally or in any way really that comes to you, are there any things that you are both excited and nervous about in the writing, like the sort of space of like, I'm trying something new, you know, and I'm really excited about it, and also I'm not sure about it, that kind of space.
Absolutely. That's terrifying. It's a terrifying space to be in, because particularly since if people expect a certain type of writing from you, they're going to continue to expect that type of writing. And I'm very bad with expectations, and because I like to thwart them at every move. For me, the scariest thing has been kind of these Smith and De Boer erasures for people to understand what they're doing, primarily because they're not fully erasures. They're more like a palimpsest, where you can still read the background, the background text is still there. It's a ghost text. And so what I was trying to enact was the possibility for people to engage with the ghost text however they like. So they can read the highlighted part, or the part that I've extracted, which is typically bold or a darker color. They can read that if they like, or they can create or hew meaning out of the words that are there from the original text. And that was kind of one of those things where I wanted to subvert the cultural artifact in keeping with the Situationist. How do you make it a different thing than what it is so that people can hew their own meaning out of it? That's hard, right? Because people want to be told what to read. You want the words right there, and you want someone to say, this is what you're supposed to understand. And I'm opening up the avenues of understanding and saying, you can take it however you like. You can read the darkened words, or you can create your own. So it's really one of those opportunities to create Mad Libs with Adam Smith and Guy Debord's work. And I'm hoping people get that, but maybe they won't, and maybe they will. I can't control it. But it's scary a little bit.
Hey, my dear sister, I love you.
How you doing?
I'm doing good. I had a question for you about, formally, you know, I love what you do with, you know, with the line in poetry. I love what you do with the sentence and your prose work. I wanted to know if you had a kind of philosophy, a kind of a craft philosophy around when you use these modes and how you use them. Is the line a kind of a mode that you would enter into when you are, let's say, plagued with a certain image, or you're considering a certain image? Does the sentence kind of, you know, kind of surface up when you are thinking of a kind of event or kind of a temporal nature of the kind of thematic that you're working with? Or is there something different working all together there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the line for me holds a lot of value, and I would really encourage folks, when you interact with any of the poems, to really read at a line level, because I try to embed dual meaning in the, I don't really call them line breaks, I call them line endings. So in the line ended poems, I'm trying to enact some dual meanings there. Not so much in the sentence format. So in the sentence format, what I'm thinking about mostly is how those sentences line up and juxtapose what comes before or after. And so sometimes I give them space to free flow, and sometimes I abort them by having a quickened ending. And sometimes I completely do away with grammatical structures entirely, like punctuation. So they're a place, I find the longer sentence a place for me to play, and the line-ended poems a place for me to really imbue another level of meaning. However that looks. And sometimes in the line-ended poems, there'll be 3 or 4, or maybe all of them will have some dual meaning embedded in them. But it's something that will encourage folks to come back to it and to sit with it. So the line-ended poems encourage a sitting with. The longer lines encourage a flow-through. So there goes that movement again. It's like either you're sitting still or you're moving with. And I think those two structures, kind of the prose poem and the more traditional formal poem with line endings, give me that opportunity to say more and say less. So I'm always interested in when do you say more and when do you say less. I have this view about restraint where I think sometimes restraint is cowardice, because there's more that you could have said that you didn't say because either you didn't know how to say it or you didn't want to. And if you sit with it, you'll figure out a way to say it. Just give it time. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. It's really still strictly inside of under the auspices of movement and how my mind is thinking at any given time.
My question is, I'm curious of the atmosphere for you when you're creating your poetry. Like, what does it look like? How do you feel? Do you put yourself in a space? I just kind of want to visualize, what does that look like for you when you're creating your best work?
I think for me, whenever I create something, I'll never think it's my best work. I actually have a hard time figuring out what my better poems are, always. Because I'm like, that's all right. I mean, I'm a hard judge of my own work, so it's hard for me to do. But I think one of the things that I move through the poem. Anybody here into astrology? There's so few of you. You don't know what I'm talking about. I move in my poems through my moon. My moon sign is a Pisces, and I'm a water sign, and so I kind of feel my way through poems. And so a lot of times I'll know that I'm finished a poem because I get a feeling. It's a somatic experience. I get a feeling in the back of my neck, almost like your hackles go up. And so I was like, oh, that's a poem. And I get that. And it's a very weird thing, and it's hard to explain to people, but it is very much a somatic experience with language. Where I'm feeling that something is ending, or oftentimes something is beginning. So if I get a word or a line from something, I'll know that I'm supposed to use it later. It's this very odd writer's intuition, where you come across something and you know that it's not something that you need to discard. It's something you need to hold on to and write it down immediately. So a part of my process, I'm taking this as a process question as well, so part of my process is constantly writing. I always have something to write on, even if it's like a raggedy piece of paper in the back of a book or something. I'm constantly, like, I can understand how Emily Dickinson has the envelope poems, because she was using whatever was around her, and that's kind of how I am. And so I just take pieces of my known world in language and piece them all together at some point, weave them together at some point. And I know that I've come to the end of that point because I feel it in my body. Very odd explanation. Not everybody has that. How do you do it?
Well, sincerely, I'm obsessive. So when I get to usually the computer, because I like to move as quickly as my mind is quickly, and I can't do that with pen and pad, I don't move until I get that feeling.
You get the feeling too.
Yeah, you just know something clicks.
You get that feeling. It's something like, oh, I feel it.
But also, if my own poem makes me go, then something has happened. If my own poem doesn't pique a curiosity or another question, then it's not done.
Right.
If it makes me feel comfortable, then I consider it a failure, to be quite honest. But then there's also a way that the following day I come back to the screen and I repeat the process. So it goes through many versions. I don't save my drafts because I'm constantly revising the thing as is.
Right.
So I'm not going to have a good box to donate to anyone's library at the end of it. But it's a consistent, nonstop practice, listening to music that does not have lyrics. Usually at night, usually well, I always write at home. I can't write anywhere else. So then I'm a homebody, I'm a hermit. So environmentally, it's isolating.
Yeah.
And then psychologically, it's isolating because nothing else exists or matters in that moment.
Exactly. It's the feeling. We both confirm it's the feeling. Yeah.
And I think we have to feel our way on out of here. But thank you for joining us.
Thank y'all for coming out.